Hi, my name's Becky Murray, and I'm the founder of a missions organisation called One by One. Alongside my husband Matthew, we pastor a new church in New Toxeter, and together we've witnessed God do some incredible things. But over these next few weeks together, I want to look at how we embrace the journey. Life is such a gift, and every day we're given is a blessing from God. But there can be times in our lives where we can't necessarily see that blessing. Some days are idyllic and wonderful, but equally, there are times when life's complicated and even sometimes painful. So throughout this series, I want to look at different scriptures and share lots of stories with you from the mission field so that how we can see in every journey, we can embrace it. Today, I want to look at God in the waiting. It's often in the preparation stages that people can either want to rush past it and dive straight into whatever the dream for their life is, or it's in that time that they become frustrated. They want to give up before they've even got going. But actually, the life lessons from the preparation stages are some of the most powerful lessons. And it's in these times that we are who we're meant to be. If we rush past this, we'll never become all that God intends for us. And it's in these waiting seasons that it's not just about rushing past the time, but it's about finding God even in the waiting. As a missionary, I often spend times in and out of airports. I love traveling and going to different nations, but the process of getting there often frustrates me. There's a man called Philip in the book of Acts who was miraculously transported from one place to another. And I always joke that if I could have one superpower, that would be mine. Never having to wait in airports or endure any more long-haul flights ever again. Patience is evidently still a fruit that needs developing in my life. But the problem with most of us is we actually live our lives this way too. We wish away our everyday lives trying to reach that destination of where we think we're supposed to be. We rush so much that we can miss the very opportunities that God puts into our everyday paths. So I want to focus on embracing the journey of our lives. 6 years ago, my granddad died and left an amount of inheritance money for the whole family. To the adults, it was given straight away, but to my son and my nephew and niece, it went into a trust fund. Now, my nephew has just turned 18 years of age this year, and so finally he's going to receive that money that was promised to him 6 years ago. If he'd have received it when he was 12, he would have probably wasted it on sweets and computer games and magazines. But 6 years on, he's now grown up and he's developed in his responsibilities. Now he wants to use this inheritance money to buy a car and help with university fees. You see, the money was promised to him years ago, but he wasn't ready to receive it then. Sometimes we just have to trust even through the seasons of waiting. God may need to prepare us before we can be released into that identity and that destiny that He has for us. In Isaiah 49 verse 2, it's one of my favourite scriptures, and it says, "He made my mouth into a sharpened sword. In the shadow of His hand He hid me. He made me into a polished arrow and concealed me in His quiver." You know, sometimes we can feel like we're almost hidden away. The quiver is the bag that the archer will wear on his back just before he's about to go out and hunt. But at the appointed time, the archer will pull back that arrow out of the quiver and align it into the bow. And right at that moment, that arrow's right lined up. It can see what it's meant to hit. The target's right there and he's all ready. But all of a sudden, just before that arrow's released, the archer will take hold of the bow and pull it back against his cheek. In that moment, the arrow's going backwards, not forwards. But it's in this very act that it's aligning right up with the target. You know, sometimes you might feel hidden away. Sometimes you might feel like you're hidden in a quiver. Or maybe you feel like you've just come out, you're aligned in the bow, you can see the target, you can see the plan God's got for you, and you feel like you're ready to go. And then all of a sudden something happens and you feel like you've almost been pulled back and you're thinking, have I done something wrong? Have I been disobedient? What's happened? But actually it's in that very pulling back season that you're being brought real close to the archer's cheek. And in that moment, you're being drawn close to God. You know, I had to go through a preparation period. As a little girl, I was 4 years old when I would often tell my mum, I'm going to be a missionary in Africa. And I dreamt of it as a tiny child. But then life takes over. I became a teenager and I had my own plans for my life. And so I wanted to go and study law. But I was in a 6-week period of a break between the college and the university. And I decided I wanted to go and see the world. I wanted to go and explore. At this point, as a teenager, I wasn't super passionate about missions, but I just wanted to go and see different nations, see the world. And so when I was 18 years old, my local church were doing a missions trip to Romania. And so I signed up for the trip, not with this huge burden for missions, but I wanted to see a different country. I wanted to taste different foods and see life. And so I went on this missions trip as an 18-year-old, and ironically, it was working with orphans. And while I was there, we had a day off one day, and I'm sat by this lake, and all of a sudden, for the first time in my life, I felt the Spirit of God speak to me so clearly, and he told me about running a children's home. I was 18 and I was so excited and full of this promise that I'd just received from God. It was the first time I'd heard him speak so directly to me like that. And so I came home and did probably what a lot of 18-year-olds would do. I told everyone, thus saith the Lord, I'm going to run a children's home. And because God had said it, I thought it would happen today or tomorrow. And yet year after year after year started to pass by, and no children's home dropped out of the sky for me. And well-meaning friends would often say, well, just go open a home somewhere. Go book a flight to Timbuktu. Just go open one. But I knew I had to wait on God. You see, I was actually 31 years old before I finally opened the doors of the King's Children's Home. I had to wait for 13 years for the fulfillment of God's promise to come to pass. But I often think about Abraham. You see, Abraham waited for 25 years. He was 75 years old when God promised him he would become a father. He said he would become a great nation. And at this point, he had no children. How do you become a great nation when you've not got one? But actually, he was 100 years old before Isaac was finally born. And it's in the years of waiting that we watch Abraham and Sarah. You see, they decide they need to help God out. Let's give God a helping hand. You know, nothing seems to be happening, so let's help God. And so Sarah comes up with this great suggestion. Nothing seems to be happening with her, so why don't Abraham, my husband, why don't you go be with my servant Hagar? So Abraham does as he's told by his wife and is intimate with Hagar, and suddenly Hagar becomes pregnant. The very thing that Sarah thought she wanted to happen was then the very thing that stung her and made her heart yearn all the more. You see, man's wisdom, it seems great, but all it can do is create heartache. You know, Isaac was always the promised child, and yet because of man's wisdom, they end up creating an Ishmael in their life. And it's in this time, you know, for me, it was this time of 13 years of waiting. I was determined not to create an Ishmael in my life, but to hold on and wait for my Isaac. It was in these 13 years that my life began to transform completely. I spent a month in Colombia working with street kids. I spent 3 months in Mozambique working with an incredible missions organization that rescued thousands upon thousands of children and plant hundreds of churches. And I changed in that time. The preparation period for me was about transforming who I am. You see, I began to fall in love with Jesus in this time. And every no that I had, every excuse as to why I could not or should not, began to slip away as I fell in love with Jesus. You see, up until this point, I guess I'd treated my walk with God almost like a tick box thing. I was saved, check. I was baptized in water, check. I was filled with the Holy Spirit, check. And it was almost like I was ticking off the boxes, and I thought that that's how I was progressing in my walk with God. But in the years of waiting, that's where I began to fall in love with Jesus. And it was in those years of waiting that I was being molded and shaped. Every excuse as to why I could not serve him. You've probably heard by now, but I have quite a thick Yorkshire accent. I come from the north of England where the accent is quite strong, and often when I go to either different parts of England or different parts of the world, people will often comment about how thick my accent is. And I would often say to God, I can't possibly speak for you, or I can't preach. I have a really strong accent. People won't even understand what I'm trying to say. Or I'll look at my life and I think, I'm not intelligent enough. There's people out there who are far better equipped for the job than I am. The only A I received in school was for cooking. And to be honest, my husband Matthew would probably dispute that as well. I'll look at my family. We're not the wealthiest of families to just go out and build a children's home somewhere. I come from a very humble family where we didn't have much money. And we can look at others that surround us, and we always see people who are far more capable than we feel we are. But the reality is, in the midst of ourselves, we're not adequate. It's only in our relationship with Jesus that together we can follow his leading. And as we fall in love with him, his will begins to unfold, but it unfolds his way. So I want to look at some lives in the Bible who also received promises from God, but they had to wait. Ironically, Joseph also had to wait 13 years. At the age of 17, Joseph has these dreams of greatness, dreams of leadership. And he shared those dreams potentially with the wrong people. And those dreams ended up selling him into slavery. But at the age of 30, he became the prime minister of Egypt. How do you go from being a slave into being the prime minister? That's quite a jump to make. His dreams led him into a pit. The pit led him into slavery, and the slavery led him into prison. I'm sure at these stages in life he was thinking, wait a minute, this is not what the dream looked like. But at each phase of the journey, the favor of God was as much on Joseph. It was as much on him right in the pit and in the prison as it was in the palace. And so I just want to look at a few scriptures with you today. So let's look at Genesis 37. We're going to read Genesis 37 and just a couple of verses from verse 6. It said, Joseph said, listen to the dream I had. We were in the field tying bundles of wheat together. My bundle stood up, and your bundles of wheat gathered around it and bowed down to it. His brothers said, do you really think you will be king over us? Do you truly think that you will rule over us? His brothers hated him even more because of the dreams and what he had said. You see, his brothers had this thing of, who do you think you are? Now, we have to be careful when we have a promise from God or a dream that we think God's given us. We have to be careful who we share that with. Joseph shared the dream of who people bowing down to him to the very people who were bowing down to him in the dream. Maybe not the wisest point. And he shares his dream with his brothers, and they have this attitude of, who do you think you are? And sometimes when we share the dream God's given us, people can look at us and think, who do you think you are? Why would God want to use you? I want to tell you today, if God's given you a promise, hold fast to that. But share it with people who are going to encourage you on the journey. Let them encourage you rather than trample the dream down. Joseph is sold into slavery by his brothers. He ends up being sold to Potiphar, who is an officer of the king, a captain of the palace guard. So let's pick it up from Genesis 39. From verse 3 it says, Potiphar saw that the Lord was with Joseph, that the Lord made Joseph successful in everything that he did. So Potiphar was very happy with Joseph and allowed him to be his own personal servant. He put Joseph in charge of the whole house, trusting him with everything he owned. Wow. I mean, he's gone from being a slave who has no human rights, the lowest of the low, to suddenly this important figure puts him in charge of his whole household. He doesn't have to worry about anything that Joseph's dealing with, because everything Joseph touched almost went to gold. And so Potiphar trusts him. But actually his wife started to begin to see Joseph and wanted to be intimate with him. And so she tries to be with him. But Joseph, who's a man of purity and integrity, says no. And because he said no, because he stood for purity, she then falsely accuses him. And these false accusations end up leading Joseph from going into from being a slave to being a prisoner. And life's gone from bad to worse. And in these stages, Joseph must have been thinking, this is not what the dream looked like. This is not how it was supposed to unfold. What is going on? But actually, God was with him. And so if we pick it up, continuing from Genesis 39, but just a few verses lower, let's pick it up from verse 21 of Genesis 39. Is now by this point, Joseph finds himself in the prison cell. And it says, but the Lord was with Joseph. You know, sometimes we might feel like, it doesn't feel like you're with me right now, God. I don't see the dream unfolding how I think it should go. Where are you in this situation? But we see here that God's with him right in the prison cell. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him kindness and caused the prison warden to like Joseph. The prison warden chose Joseph to take care of all the prisoners, and he was responsible for whatever was done in the prison. The warden paid no attention to anything in Joseph's care because the Lord was with Joseph and made him successful in everything he did. You know, Joseph was given a place of responsibility and influence. He's a prisoner just like all the other people. But there's something about Joseph that's different, and that's God's with him. You see, Joseph was learning throughout these years how to be faithful. If he'd not learned how to run Potiphar's house well, how could he rule a nation? And if he didn't know how to remain upright and humble in leading a prison cell, how could he ever lead in a palace? It was in these exact years that he was being shaped, he was being formed. Joseph then goes on to interpret the king's dreams. In Genesis 41, we read that the king dreams about 7 fat cows and 7 thin cows. And the thin cows come up and eat the 7 fat cows. He then has another dream where he sees 7 grains of heads of grain, and they're full and they're ripe and they were growing on one stalk. But then the other 7 heads of grain sprout up and they're scorched by the desert wind. And all of a sudden, these thin grains start to eat up and swallow up the full ones. And the king wakes up and he's worried. You know, he senses that these dreams have meaning. And so he gathers around all the magicians and the wise men of Egypt, but none of them can interpret the dream. Eventually, the king's butler remembers a man who interpreted his dream correctly a long time ago. He has a dream in the prison cell and Joseph correctly interprets him, but all of a sudden the butler forgets that. Sometimes we can feel forgotten by people, and Joseph must have been in that prison cell thinking, well, any day now, the butler's going to remember me, maybe. But finally, the king has this dream, and so finally the butler has a aha moment. And so they call forward Joseph, and in the grace of God, he interprets that the cows and the grain both stand for 7 years. That actually over the next 7 years, Egypt will have plenty of crops and all will be well. But that in the following 7 years, there would be famine. That God was warning them to prepare in the 7 years of plenty so that they could survive the 7 years of famine. Joseph suggests a strategy of how the nation will survive. And this leads him for the king to be promoting him to second in command all of Egypt. What a promotion. Interestingly, Joseph has to interpret other people's dreams before his own can be realized. It was only interpreting the dreams of the baker and the butler and now the king that Joseph's own dreams were fulfilled. You see, if God's given you a dream, that's wonderful. But don't forget, we don't walk the journey alone. We have to remember that you might be the very key to unlocking somebody else's dream. Maybe unlocking somebody else's dream and destiny, your own is being unlocked. And as we faithfully serve those around us, we begin to walk into our own God-given dreams and destinies. Then let's look at David. David's another incredible man of God. The Bible describes him as a man after God's own heart. Yet David has to wait 22 years from being anointed as the next king of Israel to it actually happening. So Samuel the prophet comes to the house of Jesse. Let's read that from a moment from 1 Samuel 16. And it says in 1 Samuel 16 and from verse 10, Jesse had 7 of his sons pass before Samuel. But Samuel said to him, the Lord has not chosen these. So he asked Jesse, are these all of your sons? They're still the youngest, Jesse answered. He's tending the sheep. Jesse initially forgets about David. As a mom, I'm not quite sure how you forget about your child, but somehow David's forgotten about. He's out with the sheep. Let's keep him busy with the sheep. Have you ever felt the same way? Have you ever felt like you're forgotten? So finally, they bring David, and David comes before the man of God. And in 1 Samuel 16, verse 13, it says, "So Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the presence of his brothers. And from that day on, the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David." So I can imagine the scene for David. You know, his big brothers have all been passed before the man of God, and the man of God comes, and it's no. Is there any others? Finally, his dad remembers, oh, well, there's the little one, the little David out on the field. Let's bring him. And so finally David's brought before the man of God, and he's the chosen one. He's the one in front of all of his big brothers that's selected to be the man of God. And I guess for David, that was like a, wow, look at me kind of moment. And yet the next day, what happens is the red carpet rolled out for David. Is there a golden throne for David to come and eat his breakfast at the table? No. The next day, he's still back out with the sheep. Life's still pretty normal. It must have even felt maybe mundane for David, but the promise of being king was still as true in those moments as it was the very moment that Samuel anointed him. Let's jump for a moment back to the next chapter. This is where we encounter Goliath, and he's been intimidating the army of Israel. Bearing in mind, the army of Israel are these big, strong men who've been prepared for battle. But suddenly, Goliath comes out and they're full of fear. Let's look at David's response with this. So in 1 Samuel 17 and verse 34, it says this: "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it and struck it and rescued it from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear, and this uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine." That's the key. Right there. Don't miss it. That's the key. David's been faithful in tending these sheep, often feeling like he's forgotten about, often feeling like life's normal and mundane. But actually, it was right there, tending the sheep, that he mastered the art of fighting off the lions and the bears. And so when he saw Goliath, he saw the same thing. He just saw another lion and another bear. You see, if David couldn't be faithful in protecting and leading the sheep, how could God entrust him to protect and lead his people? If you're in a season of waiting, you're in good company. God is in the waiting too. He's not just waiting for you at the destination. He's not waiting for you to catch up and arrive. He's with you on the journey. You know, I really needed the years of waiting. It was in those 13 years that I learned more about who God is and who I am. You see, I'm a daughter of the King. That's my identity. I'm the bride of Christ. That's my identity. And once I truly fell in love with Jesus, everything else began to change. You see, you replicate what you are, not just what you say. I can tell my kids at the King's Children's Home in Kenya, I can tell them how they should respond to situations, and I can teach them the Word of God, and that's all good and that's all right. But actually they watch my life. They watch how I respond to situations, and then they do likewise. You replicate what you are, not just what you say. So don't try to rush on with your destination when the journey is as much a part of your destiny too. God's working on who you really are. God will spend years molding and shaping your character so that you can maintain the position he longs for you to have. It's his gifting that he places on you, but he cares far more about your character, that you might be able to hold and take that gifting forward. Whether that's leading a nation, whether it's leading a church, or whether it's just leading your family well, God will spend years working on your character, forming and shaping you so that you begin to look like him. You see, that's the key. If we look like him in any given situation. I want to pray with you right now. Maybe you've watched today and something's just kind of connected your heart. Maybe you feel like that arrow. You feel like you're hidden away in the quiver and you feel like nothing seems to be happening. Or maybe finally you feel like you've been pulled out of the quiver and now's the time, and at that very moment where you feel you're about to be launched, there's a pulling back period and you're thinking, what's going on? Well, maybe just like Joseph and David, God's forming us, that his reflection might be on the earth too. So let me pray. Father, I thank you for everyone who is with me on this journey, that God, you are in the preparation, that God, I pray you would be reflected through us on this earth, that your word would come to pass in and through our very lives, that God, you would be glorified through us. If you're in the waiting season, know that God's in the waiting too. Embrace the journey of your character being formed. It's in this very time in the quiver that God is moulding and shaping your life. God bless.